Bourcard is the VP of Research covering beverages at the Dutch financial institution Rabobank, where he writes reports, advises wine and spirits businesses on strategy, and also hosts a popular podcast of his own, aptly called Liquid Assets. So our three key takeaways for this episode, and what we're just excited to dive into with you, Bourcard, are first, the foundational data misread crisis. So what is it that companies must understand before building any Gen Z strategy? Number two, the organizational readiness gap. So why leadership composition, as you just spoke to, is a strategic prerequisite and not an HR initiative. And number three, the investment timeline paradox. So how can we navigate resource allocation during this maybe 10 to 15 year revenue valley that you talk about in the report?
Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market with me, Barbara Fitzgerald. In this show, we'll break down the complexities of selling wine in the US by discussing the relevant issues of today with experts from around the globe. Each episode serves up three key insights to help elevate your winery's presence in the US market. So grab a pen and paper and let's pave the way for your success in the US.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Masterclass US Wine Market. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Bourcard Nesin to the show. Bourcard is the VP of Research covering beverages at the Dutch financial institution Rabobank, where he writes reports, advises wine and spirits businesses on strategy, and also hosts a popular podcast of his own, aptly called Liquid Assets. So welcome to the show, Bourcard. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I work for a bank and I have a podcast about beverages. Could I call it anything but liquid assets?
Yes.
I'm not sure I could. Also, you're really good at reading scripts. Were you a theater kid growing up?
Thank you for saying that. I wasn't. I'm actually such a high energy person that I can talk so fast. And I've learned for our international audience, I got to slow it down and really enunciate. So I just think about it a lot. And I
appreciate it.
Yeah.
If that's your advice to yourself, then I really need to slow down. And again, our podcast, Liquid Assets, I often hear people tell me they try and listen to it at 1.25 speed, which a lot of people do. There are freaks out there that listen at 2x speed. I don't know why they do that. But when I talk, they say, I can't handle it. I need to actually put it back down to 1x speed. So I'll try and slow things down for your audience.
No worries. Well, again, we're really excited to have you here today. And before we dive into the discussion on this report that you've written, can you tell us a little bit more about your background, Bourcard, and how you came to work in the wine business?
The whole story would take a long time. I think the important thing to understand, and this is actually helpful to understand the context in which the report we're here talking about came to life. I come from an academic background outside of the industry, and I was hired by Rabobank, who lends to wineries and does financial advisory for the wine industry, among many, many other things. They hired me to do research, right? And not equity analysts work, but really the opposite of what equity analysts do. I think about long-term problems that affect the industry and try and help them manage around those problems. Things like sustainability, demographic change, digital change, e-commerce. And those are problems and issues that kind of play out over a 10-year time horizon. And that's not what equity analysts are thinking about. And so I came from this academic background, a graduate degree in economics, and I was pretty shocked at what passes for good research in this business. It's just a lack of rigor, a lack of curiosity a lot of times, a lack of incredulity when it comes to data, especially surveys. And this report on Gen Z that we're here to talk about is kind of my response. It's like I wrote it in the sense that I was so tired of reading absolutely useless information about Gen Z that was too broad, too high level, was way overgeneralized, and also in many cases, I think downright wrong. And so that's why I wrote it. I want to write it to help people get a better understanding, not only of Gen Z, but how to think about things like demographic change and on any other issue that affects their business.
Yeah, I would say one of the things that I really appreciated most about reading this report is that you take the kind of broad statements that are constantly made, and even with numbers to back it up, and you ask for the story behind those numbers, because we know nothing is black and white, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I think this report does an amazing job at doing. So
I think that's great. I love that you talk about the story that I'm telling because, I'm a very data centered guy, but I'm also pretty creative and emotional person. And so a lot of times the departure point for a research project or an idea I have to write about is my own life story. Anecdotes fill in the gaps of where your ideas come from, right? Like they are the foundation of like a good idea. And, for example, the two things that I think everyone hears about Gen Z is that they're crazy conscious about health and wellness, right? And I would look at my own experience in my 20s when my skin was perfectly smooth. My abs weren't under 3 inches of, subcutaneous fat, and I had no health problems. And then I look at myself in my 30s and I'm like, wow, I have a bunch of health problems. Why are these people responding to surveys that they care about health when 25-year-olds don't have health problems like people in their 30s? What's going on here? And so that story, or at least my own story, I think is a great jumping off point to do a deeper dive. But I feel like a lot of people make the mistake of either forgetting to ask themselves, like, what was it like when I was in my 20s and I was broke and had no money and was svelte and, invincible? Or they think about that and forget to check on the data and they just rely on the anecdotes. I think I'm good at doing both.
yes, I would say so too. And to your point, to the marketers into the room, to the strategy developers, if you want to look at a generation that is very different from anything in your experience and connect with them, you have to have empathy for them. And to have empathy for them, you need to understand where they're coming from, more than just numbers. We got to fill in the kind of bits that make them alive.
Yes. Start from your own experience and figure out where that leads you. But then I would just say in response to that, before we jump into the actual content of the report, because I feel like I'm covering stuff too early in this, but there are things you can't understand about people that look different and have different lived experience, life experience than you do. And so if you're 45, 50, if you're 35 like me, and you need to develop a TikTok campaign, I'm so sorry, but you're not going to be good at that, right? And so it's really understanding, making sure you have the right people in the room to not only come up with the ideas, but develop the creative that is going to resonate with that audience is just really important. So understanding not only yourself and use that as a departure point, but understanding where the boundaries or limitations of what that will actually lead to in terms of content and ideas is also really important. And that just comes down to good hiring and, even though it's not popular right now, better diversity in the wine business.
Absolutely. And that is such a great segue into our focus for this episode. So we're going to be diving into Rabobank, or specifically also your research, Bourcard, the report titled The Real Reasons Generation Z is Drinking Less Alcohol. And we'll discuss how your data-driven analysis really challenges the conventional wisdom about, in air quotes, health-conscious Gen Z, and also reveals some structural, economic, and demographic forces that are reshaping the alcohol industry. So our 3 key takeaways for this episode and what we're just excited to dive into with you, Bourcard, are first, the foundational data misread crisis. So what is it that companies must understand before building any Gen Z strategy? Number 2, the organizational readiness gap. So why leadership composition, as you just spoke to, is a strategic prerequisite and not an HR initiative. And number 3, the investment timeline paradox. So how can we navigate resource allocation during this maybe 10 to 15 year revenue valley that you talk about in the report?
Love it.
Amazing. So let's set the stage a little bit before we dive into all of these details, just get everybody on the same page. So maybe before, we talk solutions, you can help us understand the scope. When you analyzed Gen Z's drinking patterns, what was the single most surprising data point that changed how you think about this generation?
Well, the funny thing is that like nothing here really surprised me. And that's because there was kind of this slow burn where I did a bunch of different research projects and they slowly kind of converged to create what you see here, right? I did this big research report 4 or 5 years ago about the changing demographics of the American alcohol consumer. And I found that women were the majority of alcohol consumers 26 and younger. right? They don't drink as much as boys do, but that was a big surprise when I learned it. But now we're seeing this downturn in terms of demand, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. And there's a lot of finger pointing at Gen Z. And so, I set out to answer kind of two questions in the report. The first one is Gen Z drinking less, right? Answer to that is yes, absolutely. They're drinking less than previous generations did at the same age. The next question, well, actually, I guess there are three questions here. Are they drinking less? Number two, why are they drinking less, right? Because if we don't understand why, we can't address the problem. And then three, will they always drink less? And will this trend continue? Which is very much tied to that second part, right? Because if the issues affecting Gen Z and their drinking behavior is something that is temporary or life stage centered and not necessarily some inherent hatred of alcohol, then you would expect that would go away. And so we can start with the first one of like, are they drinking less, if you want, as a starting point?
So, okay, based on what you said, yes, they are drinking less and less than other generations did at their age. What is something that we really need to understand about the why? Because it's going to change, right? How we approach them and how we expect them to grow into the category going forward.
Yeah, it's really complicated, which is one of the things that I've noticed that industry research shies away from is non-simple narratives. And it's just someone's identity is so darn complicated. And in particular, the industry has this knee-jerk reaction to say young people. Young people aren't drinking as much and they're not drinking as much wine and therefore we're in all this trouble. And I'm like, what do you mean by young people, right? Because 20 years ago, there were more young men, for example, drinking alcohol than there are today. And young men today continue to be, 25-year-old man 20 years ago and a 25-year-old man today are both 25. So age is clearly not the issue here. So what elements of culture, identity, the economy are changing? It's not just are they drinking less, but who's drinking less? And so one of the first things I did was, is this an issue of life stage or is this an issue of generational change, right? And to some extent, a lot of the hand-wringing about the industry, especially as it relates to wine, is that young people don't like wine. And I'm like, they never did. This is the problem with the industry, that they seem to think that, the reason young people aren't buying wine is because something's wrong with wine in their marketing strategy to young people. And I would say there is some problems with the industry's marketing strategy, but in reality, young people have never drunk wine. Why? More than anything, because young people are broke. They've always been broke. When I was 22 in college, I bounced a check trying to buy rice at one point. Right? These people don't have full-time jobs because they're in college. And if they're not in college, they don't have a college degree. So they're not getting higher paying jobs. And so people in their early 20s are at best in an entry-level, job with a bachelor's degree, and they're not making that much money. And so they just don't have the money to spend on better booze, and wine costs more per serving than these other things. The other thing to understand is that when young people do drink, right, they're not drinking at a sit-down dinner with a rack of lamb and a nice full-bodied, Chianti. They are partying, right? And so you actually see the data show that when young people drink, and I mean young people in their 20s, what they're doing is they're drinking 2 or 3 times a week, but they're partying. So they're having like 3 or 4 drinks. If you look at people in their 60s, right, they have like 2 or 3 more drinking occasions per month than young people. They drink way more often than young people, but almost none of them are binge drinking, right? And so wine fits this really important occasion where your life is stable, you have lots of money. It owns the meal occasion, the food occasion, which every other industry, every other brand, every other product category would be absolutely salivating over getting the chance to own. But it just isn't a product that, as currently constituted, fits the needs for somebody in their 20s, right? And so we're catastrophizing over this problem as it's something new, but it's always been there. However, and this is the big however, yes, young people are broke. Yes, a big reason they're not spending money on alcohol is because they're young and they don't have any money. And when they get older, they'll make more money, they'll have better jobs, and they'll drink more. Their life will settle down. But 10, 20 years ago, young people were spending a lot more of their income on alcohol than they are today, right? And so the question is, why? And I think there's two different explanations for that. One is a really interesting one to talk about, which is a fundamental change to what it means to be a kid and a teen in today's world, leading to a dramatically later first exposure and experience with alcohol. And the other is some fairly structural demographic shifts.
Okay, let's talk about what these two different areas are. And also let's talk about really how to distinguish between what is like a structural permanent shift versus a temporary trend.
Yeah, I guess the best way to do that second part is to just talk about one of these trends and how it kind of plays out. And maybe the best way to talk about that is like this element of young people are starting to drink later in life, right? So if you look at the data, the underage drinking has absolutely fallen off a cliff in the United States. What a good thing, right? That's wonderful. But I don't think it's a function of the alcohol industry's messaging campaigns. In fact, I would be incredibly surprised if that were the case. I think there are much broader societal changes happening that are leading to young people socializing less, that young people are having less sex, doing less drugs, drinking less alcohol. And I know it's a really awkward thing to talk about, but all of these things that, I think you can look at your own kid's life and, understand that some of this stuff is just really true. And the one finding that is really interesting to me that most people go, oh, that makes so much sense, that's perfect, is the fact that people in their teens now have trackers on their phones, right?
I'm going to ask, what is the link with, social?
Yeah. So young people are socializing less. And so therefore alcohol, a social drink, has fewer occasions to be consumed across all generations than especially in the post-pandemic period, particularly acute for young people. But the reality is if you're 16 and you go to your friend's house and you try and like sneak out into the woods to have a party, your parent is going to know because they have a like location tracker on your phone, right? And even if you don't get caught, one of your friends whose parents do have a tracker on their phone is going to catch them. Or if you all leave your phones in the same place and one parent texts you and says, oh, why isn't Becky answering her phone? Is everything okay? And then the parent group gets into starts discovering that you guys aren't where you say you are. Now, you get away with all of that, right? Like you've all your parents or your parents are, absolute
neophytes, social media neophytes.
No, the opposite of that.
Okay.
I get Luddites. Your parents are total Luddites. They hate technology. They are good parents and they don't let you get a smartphone, even though you've begged one for years. You go to a party, somebody takes a picture of you and it ends up on social media. You get kicked off of the sports teams in the United States, which are usually linked to schools, or if you're part of a sports league or extracurricular league in Europe, where there tends to be the separation of those two responsibilities, there's still a code of conduct and you get consequences. So young people whose brains aren't fully formed and they're terrible about thinking about long-term consequences have never really cared about the impacts of beverage alcohol on their health. In fact, as we've seen the share of American teenagers that have been drunk in their life drop by half, right? An absolute cratering in the share of young people who have been drunk before they get out of high school, before they go to college. Their opinions about the dangers of binge drinking has not changed, according to government data, right? What has changed is the risks of drinking have gone from a long-term theoretical health problem, which young people just don't care about because they're young and their brains don't have all the, executive functions they need. And it's now immediate, real, high-risk consequences for drinking. And so young people aren't drinking because there's no opportunities to drink. And so this is a thing where it's like, okay, you asked me to explain about the difference between life stage and generational change, right? There is a generational change happening where young people are drinking less, right? In part because they're drinking later because they're under surveillance at all time. And the risk of getting caught are much higher than they ever were when we were kids. However, that is a temporary condition, right? That young people are under the surveillance, and the data is showing that underage drinking is falling dramatically, but is completely decoupled from trends of people in their late 20s and 30s. So by the time somebody reaches 35, they are still drinking at levels that are absolutely indistinguishable from previous generations, even as those people were coming of age at a time when underage drinking was falling. And so this is an example of there is a generational change affecting young people, but it is a life stage based generational change where the condition affecting people in their teens, that means they're not drinking until they're in their 20s, which is not the case for me and my generation.
Yeah.
is a temporary condition that will has thus far not affected alcohol consumption once people reach their 30s, which for me as an outside observer, like, I don't care about alcohol volumes. I don't get compensated if we sell more wine. I can look at that and say, is there a better outcome for the industry where we get to avoid the most harmful forms of drinking, young people drinking, and young people that drink tend to binge drink, and we get to market to them when they're in their 30s and more responsible and have more resources to help if they have a problem. It just feels like the best outcome possible. It's affecting volumes, but it does seem like a permanent change, right? So we're not going to, and we don't want to, but underage drinking and young people drinking is changing. I guess the question is, will that persist, right? Will the fact that alcohol is no longer a part of coming of age in the United States and increasingly in Europe too, is that going to influence whether people drink in their 30s? And I think it will. And so even though the data shows that the underage drinking has decoupled from, drinking behavior once people reach their prime spending years in adulthood, it's really hard for me to believe that is going to persist. And so a lot of people look at this report as being highly optimistic. And, I think it's far more optimistic, or at least data-based than most of the commentary on the industry. But I just struggle to see how this trend can hold longer term.
Yeah. So to put this in a pretty package, you're saying that this is a problem of delayed onset. So likely they'll increase their consumption by the time they're in their mid-30s, when they're outside of this parental surveillance and coming into a little bit more comfort economically.
Absolutely.
If that's the case, I mean, we can all maybe take a collective sigh of relief, but that also in the short term creates this kind of 10 to 15 year revenue valley. So what are some, in your opinion, leading indicators that companies should really be tracking to know if they're investing wisely in this period versus just burning cash in their effort to invest in a relationship with a low consuming demographic?
I'm going to do a very annoying thing. I'm going to pivot back to what I wanted to talk about anyways. Which is to understand whether or not you're making the right investment. It's not enough to know that young people are drinking less. And even to extent why they're drinking less, I think it's really, really important to know which young people are drinking less. And so this is where that demographic piece comes in. Because if you want to understand if you're marketing to the right people, you want to make sure you're marketing to the people that are actually drinking and are driving culture and what's cool. So the other component of this research focused on demographics, right? And essentially, when we think about young people are drinking less, and this is true in the United States, I don't know, I can't say whether it's true in Europe. I've looked at the data and it doesn't seem to be quite the same degree of truth. But if you say which people are drinking less, it's boys. It's all boys. All of the loss in volume among Gen Z and drinking behavior is accountable from boys drinking less. Women drink the same they did 15 years ago, a little bit less than they did 5 years ago, but way more than they did 50 years ago. And so really the issue is that the drinking population is shifting towards demographic groups. The composition of the population in the United States comprises people that drink less. For example, if I'm a boy and I go out to drink, I need twice as many drinks on average as a woman does. And so if, say, for every boy that is replaced by a woman that drinks alcohol, you see a 50% reduction in volume, right? Now, there's also demographic change. So Gen Z is way more diverse than previous generations. Gen Z born 1997 to 2014, right? Is that boomers kind of 50 to 64, 45 to 64, 1945 to 1964, so 63, they were 30% people of color, minority. Gen Z is 50%, right? And white people drink way more than any other demographic group. And so we're in this weird situation where even if all white people drink exactly the same they did previously, and all Black people, all Asian and Latino consumers drink the same amount they did 50 years ago, the share of those groups in the population could lead to a significant decrease in volumes. So the question is not, are young people drinking less, but who are young people? What do young people look like? And therefore, if I'm trying to market to, my conception of my consumer is this like frat boy, well, guess what? The majority of college age alcohol consumers are women, right? And they're driving culture and they're driving what's cool. And even hetero boys want to be attractive to hetero women. And so they're going to do things that are optimized to attract a modern woman, which maybe doesn't include a lot of sexist nonsense, right? That's not always the case, but I think it's just really helpful to understand that the profile of who drinks is changing. The share of the population that is, or the segments of the population that are growing also look very different, right? If you're in the business of marketing to Latinos or to Asian consumers, like you don't have to take share from your competitors to grow. Like that is a growing demographic group. And the last thing I would say is, I think a big part of the story is that, women are now the majority of consumers 25 and under. I think if you broke the data down, you'd find that they're the majority of consumers under 30 in the United States. And women drink half as much as men do. That's not good if you're concerned about volume. But women at that age, the reason they're drinking more is largely because they are getting college degrees at rates greater than men. Something like 60% of recent college graduates in the United States are women. And the reason you get a college degree is because the income you make on the back of the degree is greater than the costs of getting that education. And so you get an education to make more money. And so it is also the most reliable demographic indicator on whether somebody drinks or not.
Yeah.
And they have the money to buy the drinks. And also the gender pay gap is something that expands over time, right? And so all these people entering the workforce in their 20s, they're more women. And women have just as much money to spend as boys do. And so what you end up having is premiumization, right? A fact that a woman makes as much as a man but needs to drink half as much means they may be drinking half the volumes, but they could be spending twice as much per serving and dedicate the exact same share of income to alcohol as boys do. And so this demographic change is one part, not the only part, but one part of like what's driving premiumization and could explain, for example, why white wine is performing better in the market. Why premium white wine is performing particularly well is that all these badass college-educated women are coming into the workforce, having gotten out from under the surveilling thumb of their parents in their early 20s, and they need to socialize and they need to have work drinks and other things. And a lot of times they're, because white wine has been marketed in a gendered way towards women for decades, women are drinking more white wine and red wine is declining. Why? Boys are the ones that are actually drinking less. So it does help us explain where to go, but it also helps us understand which categories might outperform. And I think the biggest one is it helps us understand what our workforce needs to look like to successfully market to these people.
Yes. This is one of the things that I think your report does so beautifully is it really succinctly, that's the other nice thing about this report for anyone who hasn't read it. It's only 10 pages. So there's like,
could you put a link to it in the episode description? I'll let you do that if you want.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. But in 10 pages, there is so much juicy kind of, again, behind the numbers explanations. So like you just said, it's not that people are drinking less because of an aversion to the category. It's simply almost like physiology.
Yeah. Women are smaller than men. And also, they're not as dumb. They don't do as many dumb stuff. Like boys are far more likely to be risk-taking, which is one of the reasons we die younger, is because we're kind of dumb. And I'm saying that playfully, but the honest truth is that, women tend to drink more responsibly. As women drink more, does the burden of alcohol use and alcohol use disorder increase at a population level? Yes, but the share of women that have alcohol use disorder is much lower than the share of men that have alcohol use disorder. So we're actually seeing like certain health outcomes like binge drinking behavior decline at a population level, even as they're rising among women, right? Yeah. Because women drink more responsibly, not only because they're smaller, but because they're more responsible.
Yeah. And before, it's really important for us to get to talking about, the internal makeup of companies. Before we get there, one other kind of demystifying thing that you talk about that I think is so interesting is Gen Z and health, because everyone likes to say that this is a health obsessed generation. They're so preoccupied with health. But your take is that is because they're generally unhealthy population. So can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
So you asked me earlier, what was the thing that surprised you most? And I'm just kind of a curious guy. And again, I had this problem bumping around my head. I was like, when I was in my 20s, I was invincible. My body was a temple for drugs and alcohol, right? That was like my mentality. And yet I could do anything to my body and it recovered immediately, right? And so my question was always like, wait, why are young people saying they're healthy when they're not in their 30s yet? Their blood pressure is fine. What's going on? And I actually ended up looking at the obesity rates and the share of the population age 15 to 25 that's overweight. And it's just dramatically higher than it was in the 90s. Like this is like literally based on that metric, the least healthy generation that's ever lived in the United States. And this is something that's replicated in country after country after country after country. Now, what's causing the obesity crisis? It's so complicated. It's food, it's public policy, it's sedentary lifestyles, it's genetics, it's all super complex. But when it comes to the industry, like it means that people say they care about health, but they're still buying a 750 calorie coffee drink from their coffee shop. They say they care about health, and yet the most popular wine available to young people is XXL, a Moldovan monstrosity that's 16% alcohol and super sweet, right? And so this absolute contradiction of what an economist would say between stated preference, which is that I care about health, and revealed preference, which is what their behavior is. And so in a lot of ways, a young person, and this is where the aha moment came for me, if somebody answers to a survey, you care about health, right? Does it mean A, that you're healthy, that you're doing exercise every day, you eat fruit and vegetables and not that much meat? Or does it mean B, that you have a health problem you're trying to fix? And I think a big reason why Gen Z is looking at health and saying they care about health isn't because they're healthy, isn't because they're not drinking, isn't because they're not partying, it's because they have a health problem. And the same thing to drive this home for people who don't believe me, it's everyone says Gen Z cares about mental health, right? They care about mental well-being more than previous generations did. And I'm like, because they have mental health problems, the share of teenagers that have a major depressive episode in the United States since the advent of smartphones has more than doubled in the United States. The share of young boys, teenagers that are on ADHD medications and therefore need to see a therapist and a med manager every year is so high, I don't believe the numbers, right? The number of people on anti-anxiety medication. So if you tell me this generation cares about mental health, it's not because they're more well. They're not doing a better job of taking care of themselves than my generation was or previous generations. It means they're actually less well and they're struggling to improve their lives. And so they're saying, I want to fix this. But because their brains are unformed and still growing and they're poor, they don't have either the resources, the environment, or the capacity, the ability to thrive. And so a lot of the hope is they'll get that, or at least we're reaching a breaking point as a society. And now I'm straying away from alcohol, but the hope is that we're realizing that things like cell phones and screens aren't actually helpful to people's well-being. And the more you can delay screens and more you can reduce screen time and build social connections between people, the better off we'll be. And as a beverage alcohol business, you now are confronting a reality where your product depends on people socializing. So, right, when people are in their 20s and they're ready to go out and meet other people, they're less interested in doing that. There are fewer opportunities to do that. And the question is, how do you get them to do that?
That is the conundrum, right? Because the easiest way to reach people is via social media. And it's this paradox of, yes, we need to encourage people to get together through the medium that is preventing them from getting together.
Yeah. And so to some extent, linking this back to strategy and tactics, one of the things that I've really started to embrace is something I'm calling do it for the sickos. This idea that like all of us have something we love to do that like we don't want to tell anybody we love to do because it's like kind of weird or it's kind of not like a big community. For example, I love watching people play Dungeons and Dragons on YouTube. Those who don't know, Dungeons and Dragons is a fantasy role-playing game, which is essentially improvised storytelling with a very simple set of rules that allow you to die, essentially, in this universe. And I love watching it, but it's kind of weird. I'm even kind of, questioning whether I should share it publicly. And yet, my favorite group of like performers or YouTube Dungeons and Dragons players sold out Madison Square Garden to do a live 2-hour Dungeons and Dragons campaign. So there is these niche communities that are incredibly popular. And then like Dungeons and Dragons, super popular, totally crazy fan base. But then Stranger Things, the most popular television show on Netflix, is all linked to Dungeons and Dragons, right? Things like Game of Thrones, like all these creators in the world today, a lot of them grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons because it's the kind of activity that drives the creativity that is needed to write television and come up with these fantastical worlds and adventures. And so it's becoming a bigger part of culture. And so you're like, how can I do this for this group and like get them crazy excited? But there's clearly something universally exciting about that, right? There's something that like leads to the success that Stranger Things, like all those kids do on that show is play Dungeons and Dragons, right? And all the characters and the language from it, all the monsters from that show come from Dungeons and Dragons. And so it's these kind of things where you're like, how can I get this absolutely wild fan base excited about this very specific thing that somehow reflects the needs, the excitement of a much broader audience? And I think that strategy also applies to demographics. If you recognize that what young people are more diverse, right? They're more likely to be a woman with a college education. They're far more likely to be Latino. They're far more likely to be Asian than any other generation in the history of the world. And then you look at pop culture and you go, who's the most popular artist not named Taylor Swift in the universe? And it's Bad Bunny. He is a musician that sings exclusively in Spanish, right? And you go, is marketing to Latinos with Bad Bunny going to alienate my white consumers, my Asian consumers, my Black consumers? The answer is absolutely not, because Bad Bunny is badass. He's awesome. But then a more specific example, right? And this is where the hiring comes in, right? We as an industry need to avoid falling into the trap of believing that occasion-based marketing solves the problem of diversity. That as long as we market to Christmas, we are connecting with everyone who celebrates Christmas. There's a big problem with that idea. Not everyone celebrates Christmas the same way. If I'm a white American Christian and I'm celebrating Christmas, as I did as a child with my dad's family, it is Christmas sweaters, quiet music, no drinking, no partying. Maybe my grandma was drinking a bit of wine. Everyone goes home at 8 p.m. and like opens presents the next morning, right? If you're Venezuelan, as I'm half Venezuelan, and it's Christmas, one, there's nothing quiet about it. You are partying your brains off. You are going absolutely crazy that night. La hora loca. So like 10 p.m., you start like you turn off the lights, turn the music all the way up. Everyone's drunk. Everyone has like fancy glasses on. They're partying like crazy. And the chaos doesn't stop there. The kids don't open presents in the morning. They open presents at midnight from El Niño Jesus or at Papa Noel or whatever, right? So baby Jesus comes at midnight and kids open presents. So they have to stay up till midnight, right? And then they play with their presents the next day. Like that's absolutely nuts, right? But if you're trying to attract Latinos and you're marketing to Christmas and you're not depicting that crazy party environment, you're not actually connecting with Latinos. And the only people who know what that looks like and knows what that feels like are Latinos.
Yes.
And I have met no Latino marketers in the entire wine industry. I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I'm lying. I know exactly one. And so these ideas, this creative is just not a part of the industry. And yet, if you're able to connect with that Latino audience, you're connecting with a core audience that is growing in share of the population, but also the changes in the profile of those demographics, the rate at which Latinos are getting college degrees is increasing at a rate much faster than white people, right? So it's actually not just a population growth at a high level, but the profiles of the people in that population that are driving the income and the lifestyles that allow them to buy better wine and things like that, right? And so if you're not able to hire people that know how to market to Latinos because they are Latino, you're not going to connect with that audience. And then going back to this thing of like making it universal, who doesn't want to party, right? Who doesn't want to have that awful experience of being so bored on Christmas Eve with their boring family and have it be a freaking party? You know, who doesn't want that? And then you go, wait, is that also, this is an Italian wine podcast, right?
Yes.
What is Christmas Eve like in Rome and Italy? Is it just a tepid affair where family gets together and it's a quiet get together and nobody's drinking? There's no dancing or wildness? No, right? This is a big deal. This is a huge thing. And so you go, okay, my white Anglo experience doesn't reflect that, but that's what all the marketing looks like. And I want to market to Latinos. So I focus on this, like, you know, it's not just the people in the ads, but what are they actually doing? And it's a Latino Christmas. But guess what? That's exactly what Italians do. And so now I'm connecting with all the Italian audiences and the Italian American audiences. And it's all based on this little starting point, which is, what if we hired a slightly different marketer? You know?
Yeah.
And for me, the wine industry doesn't have the margins to do what spirits do. They don't have the capabilities, but therefore they need to be creative. And no other industry, no other company, not a single company I know of in the wine business has even tried this strategy of like, what if we hired a 25-year-old like Latina to manage our social accounts? What if we just tried that? It's cheap. What's the worst that could happen? Because we have a legal team, we have guardrails around them. Just go and do something different. And for me, that's what I would like to see the wine industry do, is think about these demographic things to build an idea of their consumer and confidently market to them, knowing that it is going to rejuvenate and energize the marketing that their core traditional audience sees. Because again, Bad Bunny is not just cool to Latinos, he's cool to everybody.
So to kind of, again, just summarize this takeaway that you're talking about, you know, traditional alcohol industry leadership at the moment can't authentically reach a consumer base that is becoming more and more multicultural, becoming majority female. And this isn't about diversity just as a social responsibility. It's about, you know, whether the companies have the organizational capability to connect with future customers, future audiences.
So, like, again, who's going to be your brand manager, right? If you're marketing in New York, if you're for a New York-based company, you live in Connecticut, you know, you make 250 grand a year. You know, you're probably white, if we're being honest. You're probably a man, if we're being honest. And your job as a high income suburban dude with a plump belly getting a fat paycheck is to come up with a way to market to a bunch of Latina women in their 20s who have no money. How on earth do you think that's going to work out? Right? And you can do all the stuff you want with focus groups and all of that. Wine industry tends not to do that. And even that would be helpful. But like, it's again, we started this out talking about, you know, the need to think through your own personal experience to inform ideas and then fill in the gaps and interrogate those ideas with data. But you also have to understand what you're not going to be able to do. And me, as somebody who grew up in rural Maine, in a town of 400 people, who doesn't have Instagram and doesn't have any social media, I'm very sorry, but I'm not going to be able to build a good digital strategy around TikTok, right? I'm sorry, I can't do that. And so it's understanding what you can't do and then going out and hiring the people who can do it. And the wonderful thing is that because the demographic drivers that are driving consumption are education, empowerment, income, that means the people you need to hire to do this well are qualified to do the job. But for some reason, this industry has systematically, consistently, and almost universally failed to hire any diversity and failed, therefore, to attract a diverse audience to their brands.
I could talk with you about this all day, but I guess we do have to wrap up at a certain point. So before we get to that, I want to ask kind of one final question about
Yeah.
all of this. If a brand came to you tomorrow saying, Bourcard, we want to be ready for Gen Z's peak spending years, what do you tell? What do they need to audit about their current organization before you even discuss these strategic marketing tactics?
I both hate and love this question, in part because I don't know shit. I don't know your brand. I don't know your business. I don't know what channels you sell into, right? So I don't see my job as being able to tell people what to do. What I want to do is tell people, slow down and think about who your audience is. It's not young people, right? Young people aren't drinking less. Young men are drinking less, right? So maybe you want to say like, oh, how do I figure out how to make men engage with my brand more? Because, I want to build back that part of the business, right? But if you don't identify the problem, if you're not being specific, and I think that's a really big part of this, people like to say multicultural as a term. And I'm being pedantic here, but like, I always kind of cringe at that because I'm like, you mean, so white people isn't culture, right? So you end up with these euphemisms to mean like people of color, right? And even that's a euphemism because my wife's a white Venezuelan, right? So again, being really specific. And the beauty of that specificity is it becomes real, right? And if you're marketing to these high level ideas, you're marketing to stereotypes. And the only way to market to these audiences thoughtfully is actually to subvert those stereotypes. And the only people who can effectively subvert stereotypes are the people who belong to those communities. And that doesn't mean you need to go out and fire all your current marketing staff and hire a bunch of diverse people. It might mean somebody on our staff is absolutely nuts about Dungeons and Dragons. And so why don't we try and connect with that community in ways that are really, really well informed and really, really specific to them? And in the hopes of doing that, actually create something that's more generalizably true. For example, my favorite movie of all time is, or at least one of my favorite movies of all time is Moonlight, right? Which is about a gay Black kid growing up in a home destroyed by addiction and drugs. I can't relate to any of that, but I connected with that character. I connected with that film because those things are universal. There are elements of that are meaningful to so many people. And so that's where I'd like to say, like, those are the kind of things that I think really need to, resonate with these people. If you want to get people out of the house, you need to really trigger their interest and reflecting the things that they like most, their really special desires or favorite things that they only talk about with their best friends. Like, that's the kind of stuff that for me will help brands overcome this really difficult environment we're in, not just from a sales perspective, but from a societal one. And the only way you can figure out what those things are is to figure out who you're trying to connect with. And young people is not good enough. Women is not good enough. You need to work harder and get very specific about what you're trying to do and let that specificity become something wonderful and universal in a way that like you'd never imagined. That
is spot on, fantastic tactical advice. And also kudos to you for being able to weave Dungeons and Dragons into this twice.
I mean, it's a thank you. I'm the only banker person that like talks about teenage drug use and Dungeons and Dragons and somehow makes it work. So I appreciate it.
Amazing. Okay, so as we start to wind down, we like to wrap up here on Masterclass US Wine Market with a rapid fire quiz to help our listeners just better understand the US market kind of through the lessons of this episode. So just try to answer in a couple sentences if you can. But number one, what is your number one tip for mastering the US wine market? A very broad question for 2 sentences.
Have an insane amount of capital to invest in salespeople.
That's a very good bit of advice.
But also true for every market. So universal advice.
Number 2, what is something you would have told your younger professional self about selling wine in the U.S.?
Younger professional self about selling wine in the U.S.? Make sure you're not just selling wine.
Yeah.
Diversify. Yeah, I never sold wine. I just write about it, but I guess that would be it. Is like, if you're just lending to the wine business or if you're just exposed to the wine business, things are pretty tough right now. So diversifying your business has been pretty consistently a good play for those who have done it.
Yeah, great advice. And for those that, can't diversify the product, I would say about diversifying markets then. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
Okay, and number 3, we move around a lot in this business. So what is your favorite just kind of practical travel hack when doing market work or visiting somewhere else?
Can it be a little bit gross?
It could be whatever you want.
Take Gas-X before you fly is the one. So I hate flying because I always feel super bloated. And I discovered that there's this magical drug that has no known side effects that helps with that. So I take Gas-X before I fly, and I don't feel bloated when I get off the plane because the air pressure changes and your belly gets inflated and it's uncomfortable. And that's it. That's my travel hack. Take Gas-X before you fly. You will never regret it.
Amazing. You should reach out to them about being a sponsor.
Yeah.
Bourcard, thank you so much for joining us today on Masterclass US Wine Market. This has been so invaluable. I could have gone on forever.
I'm glad you didn't, because I don't know if I would have stopped talking. I apologize for those who don't like hearing 5-minute monologues about the importance of diversity.
I find this all super helpful. If any of our listeners want to connect with you, how can they do that?
My favorite place to connect with me is my podcast. So we can, you're listening to a podcast about wine. We are a podcast that covers wine. It's called Liquid Assets. I also have a research website, and I'll just make sure that the folks at Masterclass US Wine Market get my details, the research website where you can read our reports and access the podcast.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Bourcard. I hope to see you in person sometime really soon. We can have some wine and talk about Dungeons and Dragons.
I'll see you in Chicago, and I'm happy to educate you about Dungeons and Dragons.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Masterclass US Wine Market. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to stay up to date with the latest industry trends, remember to like, follow, and share our podcast. And if you find value in our conversations, please leave us a review to help others discover the show and grow our community. Stay tuned for new episodes every Monday. Until then, brindiamo il vostro successo.